Let's say one day you're on holiday in San Lucia, a beautiful island in the paradise of the Caribbean, and you look up at the mountains and you notice some smoke rising. You remind yourself of the old adage, there's no smoke without fire, and you naturally jump to the conclusion that there is in fact a fire on the mountain. Unbeknownst to you, however, what you have seen is smoke rising from a sulphur spring. It's a local geological occurrence that any native could have told you about, but being a humble tourist and a confident philosopher, you accept your original inference as fact and marvel at your powers of induction. Your ignorance of local geology leads you to the belief that there is a fire on the mountain. Now, let's add an epistemological twist to this little holiday. There is in fact a fire on the mountain. It's got nothing to do with the smoke you saw, but somewhere else on the mountain there is a small fire burning. The presence of this other fire makes your belief correct, but the question is, can you be said to have known that there was a fire on the mountain?
Obviously what we're getting at here is whether you can know things by accident. Does it count as knowledge if you've inferred something true, the fire, from something false, the smoke? These might seem like either trivial or fascinating questions. Regardless, they've been incredibly important to the field of philosophy known as epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge.
That's Matt from the channel Ideas Sleep Furiously. We've collaborated for this series we're calling Epistemology Gone Wild. In this first episode, we reveal an age-old philosophical story to be an inconvenient myth. We start in Massachusetts.
The year is 1963. A young Edmund Gettier has finished his PhD. He is but a humble postdoc, and yet he's just penned a 3-page paper which will elevate him to a chair in philosophy and immortalise his name in the annals of the field. The paper presents a series of what will come to be known as Gettier Problems. That question James started the video with, that's a Gettier problem. But why were they so revolutionary?
Well, using a spot of logic, Gettier appeared to have overturned Plato's definition of knowledge, which had been considered authoritative for over 2,000 years. In Plato's dialogue to Theaetetus, he suggests a possible definition of knowledge as justified true belief. This tripartite definition claims that you know some proposition P if and only if the proposition P is true, you believe that P, and your belief in P is justified.
As a side note, Plato is interested in a very specific type of knowledge here. He's not concerned with what we might call ability knowledge, knowing how to tie your laces or how to ride a bike, or acquaintance knowledge, which is knowing your parents or knowing anybody. Instead, Plato is trying to define what's called propositional knowledge, or descriptive knowledge. Rather than knowledge of or knowledge how, propositional knowledge is knowledge that. It's knowledge of particular facts based on our theories and ideas about the world.
So to recap, to believe means to accept something as true, usually without proof. To have a justification is to have a proof. If that justified belief therefore happens to be true, you have knowledge. At first glance, justified true belief doesn't seem that bad a definition of propositional knowledge. For example, what's going on when I say I know the time is 8 p.m. because the clock says so? I have a belief. It's justified because the clock is how we measure time, and it happens to be true because, well, everybody agrees that that's how time works.
Yeah, only that's quite clearly a problematic definition of propositional knowledge. What if the clock is dead, but you catch it at one of those proverbial moments twice a day, when the stopped clock happens to be right? It seems intuitively odd to say that knowledge has nothing to do with a reliable process. So yes, you'd have justified true belief, but can you really be said to know the time?
And this was Gettier's refutation to Plato's theory, only he used a different example to a stopped clock. Take two people, Smith and Jones, who are both applying for a job. Smith knows that Jones is going to get the job because the boss has told him so. Smith has also placed 10 coins in Jones's pocket, so he deduces the following. The man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. He seems therefore to have a pretty solid, justified true belief.
However, it turns out that Smith gets the job, and unbeknownst to him, he also has 10 coins in his pocket. Boom, take that Plato, end of video, fade to black.
Only it isn't true. This story has become part of the myth of modern academic philosophy, but it's simply not true. Instead, it's a quaint tale that tells us much about the self-perception of philosophy at the time. It has all the elements of a good story. There's the established ancient order represented by Plato, and then there's the rebel Prometheus represented by Gettier, and it's a takedown of all that is sacred and the instantiation of a great leap forward. But it's not true.
To claim that it was Plato's belief that propositional knowledge is justified true belief is patently absurd. How do we know? Well, in the Theaetetus, this definition doesn't come from the mouth of Socrates, but from his interlocutor, the eponymous Theaetetus, a 16-year-old boy. And Socrates never endorses this view, in fact he explicitly rejects it.
Anyone who had genuinely read the dialogue could not have thought that Plato was arguing for justified true belief, and yet that is the narrative we are fed today. It is interesting to consider whether 20th century philosophers before Gettier even adhered to this belief. It seems unlikely, but when you get a cute little story like Gettier, it's enticing. It's fun to create a big story. Rather than Gettier overthrows the opinions of a 16-year-old boy in the dialogue over 2 millennia ago, it's much more fun to say Gettier has overthrown Plato as David overthrew Goliath.
But that is not all. You see, that Gettier problem about the smoke and the fire that we started with, that actually comes from ancient Indian epistemology. That's right, the Indians beat Gettier to it. The two people who seemed most aware of Gettier-like problems were Prasatapada in the 6th century BCE and Srihasa in the 12th. And like Gettier, both of them rejected these as cases of actual knowledge.
So what did Plato actually believe about knowledge? This is by no means an easy thing to work out. At the minimum, we can say Plato had a very demanding view of knowledge in that it related to his theory of the unchanging eternal world of the forms. Plato says that we can divide reality into the realm of the sensible, what we detect through our senses, and the realm of the intelligible, what we discover using the intellect. So we form beliefs about the changeable natural world, but we gain knowledge using reasoning and mathematics and philosophy of abstract things like numbers and concepts. In other words, Plato believes not only that you cannot know what is false, but that you can only know that which doesn't change.
And the forms never change. Hence, they're the only things that we're capable of gaining knowledge of, or approaching knowledge of. And remember, the forms are not part of the sensible world, so we can only get to them via a priori methods, or analytically. That's what it means to be a rationalist, to believe that sense experience doesn't provide us with any guarantee that what we experience is, in fact, true. That's the key lesson of Plato's cave, of course. The world above the cave is the world of the forms.
Our cave world is but a pale reflection of the true reality. We can approximate it like projecting a 2D model of a 4D shape, the tesseract, and we can understand the tesseract intellectually if we have the geometric aptitude, but we will never know it in the sensible world.
But most philosophers today would agree that Plato was wrong to distinguish belief and knowledge as he does. Belief and knowledge don't have to be about different things, because what is known is always true. You cannot know something that changes from true to false. Plato's explanation for this is that we can only know about things that cannot change.
Right, but it's possible to differentiate the truth known from the object by referring to truth at a specific time or in a particular context. I can say I know this book is a certain size, for example, but obviously its size could change if I start eating it, which, by the way, is the fastest way to acquire knowledge.
James knows what size the book is at this specific moment in time, and that truth won't change even if he starts eating the book. Plato is a genius, no doubt, but he does seem to have conflated a property of knowledge, which is the truth of the proposition known doesn't change, with a property of the object of knowledge. It doesn't change.
So in summary, Plato's attempt to say that knowledge is never a form of belief is questionable to say the least. Even if you can dance your way around a conflation, you'd still have to accept some version of Plato's forms. His epistemology seems to derive from his metaphysics.
So where does this leave us? Are we back to some form of the tripartite definition of knowledge? This is worrying because if we can't work out what knowledge is, how can we say that we know anything? Well, not so fast, because modern-day epistemologists have actually looked back to the ancients for inspiration. Next week, we look at their answers in the form of virtue epistemology.
That's everything for this episode of Epistemology Gone Wild. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week for part 2 over on Maths channel Ideas Sleep Furiously.